whatever language you use, you need to be good as a coach at being able to pick up the emotional cues in your person. You ask them a question, they give you an answer, but you're seeing something emotionally different. You're seeing something in their body language that's indicating they may not be fully in agreement with it, or you get the sense that they're putting the barriers down or they're covering up or something. A good coach is going to be able to see and pick up on those emotional cues. And there's a particular area of the brain, and it sits almost where the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex join, called the fusiform face area or the fusiform expert area. And it's specifically designed to read emotions in faces. So as a coach, we need to be using all of our brain to be able to pick up on those cues. But also, we don't want to get so caught up in the limbic system and the emotional empathy that we stop thinking clearly to help our client move forward.
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.
How come talking about our feelings is so difficult? And how come expressing my feelings becomes so much easier if I can talk about a picture that I can hold here and that describes me today rather than just talking about myself? If you're listening to this podcast, I think chances are not so bad that you have already tried this sort of picture-based check-in before. But do you know how it actually works? Which regions of the brain are active when in this process? I've used pictures and emotion cards in client work a million times, but on that biology part, I was always quite clueless. So for today's episode, I got myself one of the leading educators from the other side of the world. Sue Langley is a leading positive psychology practitioner and trainer, working a ton with the psychology of pictures, of emotions. These are the two main areas we unpack in depth today. Sue is based in Australia, but she's just back from a bunch of conferences in Europe. So let's hear what she has experienced there. You said you have been traveling Europe now. You're based in Australia and you've been on two different conferences giving talks about your work. So would you like to share a bit, where have you been and what have you been talking about?
Of course. So in the positive psychology space, every other year there's the European Conference of Positive Psychology, and alternate years is the IPA, the International Positive Psychology Association World Congress. So I tried to go to both, and I often speak at many of them. So recently, the ECPP, the European Conference of Positive Psychology, was in Dublin. It was a great event, and I did several sessions. So I did a pre-conference workshop. I did a session around flipping the strengths script and thinking about strengths differently. And I did a panel session and discussion on the future of positive psychology and well-being and how practitioners and academics can come together, because I very much consider myself a practitioner. But everything I teach is based on science and rigor and evidence, etc. I'm lucky I get to travel all around the world, speaking at different events, conferences with corporate clients, and I do a lot of consultants to the consultants, so accreditation programs and teaching people how to teach well-being and positive psychology and neuroscience as well.
Nice. When I was preparing, I also saw you talk a lot about pictures and emotions. And that is actually very close also to my heart and to our work at MetaFox. I will do an exercise which I have done in the early episodes of this podcast to get to know the guests.
Okay.
Today, it's not only about getting to know you, we will also a bit unpack this, what's actually happening there afterwards.
Okay.
Then let me get some picture cards on the table and ask you which picture describes you lately.
Okay. Oh, no, not that. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to go with, I'm not going to stick to your rules, and I'm going to do two.
Yeah, let's put those on the table.
Okay.
And we have two images now. And maybe for everybody who's not listening, would you like to describe them to us?
So one image is a drop of water and a ripple that goes out across a pond or a bowl, or it could be anything. There's just a drop of water. It's black and white, and normally I'd want color, but this one's black and white. And then the second image I've chosen is a graffiti drawing of a red heart and a little person hanging off the heart. So it describes me and my work in a couple of different ways. One is the ripple effect. I often talk about the ripple effect. If I focus on the science, I talk about Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler's work that they found that the health-related behaviors of one person has a ripple effect several degrees beyond you, for instance. So if you have more negative health-related behaviors or more positive health-related behaviors, the ripple effect in the friend scenario is 3 degrees beyond you. So, for instance, if I increase my well-being and you are my friend, there's a 15% increased chance yours will go up, a 10% increased chance a friend of yours, and a 5.6% chance that a friend of theirs will go up. And I love that idea of the ripple effect because for me personally, I have this idea of rising tide floats all boats, as in if I can teach people, I work a lot with other consultants and coaches and things like that. And if I can help them do better and lift their well-being and lift their quality of what they do, then they will go out and teach more people that I will never reach. You know, I've had people who are construction workers who are going to do a much better job at reaching other construction workers around their well-being than I will. So for me, that ripple effect is that sometimes we don't see the ripple effect that we have, but how we show up changes the worlds of the people around us. So for me, it's very much about what drops or what ripples am I creating? How am I showing up on this call right now? How do I show up my first meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning, my last meeting at 9 o'clock at night? How do I show up as the best version of me and then create that ripple effect to as many people as I possibly can? And the second image, the heart with the person hanging off it, we actually have image cards that we use all the time in what we do. They're called Inspire Action cards. And we actually have a very similar image to that was taken by my husband. It was graffiti in Florence. I don't know where this one was, but it was on a wall in Florence. The heart was filled in, so it's a different graffiti. And I loved it because the idea for me is when it comes to well-being, when it comes to positive psychology, we know that human connection is so important. I have a keynote that I do called The Future is Human, and it's really about how, yes, in the age of AI, that's great, but there are certain human skills that are critical to our thriving. If you look at the longevity study, if you look at research from positive psychology across almost every country in the world, you'll find that human connection is one of the number one contributors to high levels of well-being. So for me, the little heart with the person hanging is, can I help lift people, lift society through those human skills of learning about emotions, learning about flourishing, learning about how our brains are wired so that I can show up as the best version of me, which helps you become the best version of you. So both of those, I suppose, link to what I do. Just one last thing, across our entire business, our purpose, if you like, is to make a positive difference to global human flourishing. So those two images relate to what we do as a team of making a positive difference on global human flourishing.
Awesome. This resonates a lot with me, and I'm sure also with a lot of our audience, because most people listening to us are coaches or facilitators, helping other people to flourish and also creating those ripple effects that you spoke to. And this exercise that we just did, it is something that you also often do. What makes it easier for your audience, your participants, to engage with a picture rather than just talking about themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question, Toby, because one of the things that I often use our exercise for with the images is because I know I'm going to be talking about emotions. So I'm often dealing with whether it's coaches or consultants and doing the trainer aspect for them, or whether it's dealing with senior leaders. And if I'm talking about emotions and I'm going to get into the emotion stuff, suddenly just saying to somebody, so how do you feel? Or we're going to talk about emotions. Tell me about your emotions. It's kind of can be a bit awkward. Even if someone says to me, how are you? And I'm like, yeah, I'm good. I don't know. How do I go? Where do I go from there? Whereas when you ask people to choose an image that you say, okay, tell me about yourself in your worst mood, and somebody chooses an image that looks like that, you're like, okay, so describe it to me. And well, I feel stuck, I feel drained, I feel exhausted. But now I'm talking about the image. I'm not necessarily talking about me. So it's kind of safe. It's also that people will see things in images that they don't even know what it is. Like I know one of our images, actually I've got it here, is this one. And sometimes people are not aware of what it is. And so they look at it at different angles and they're not quite sure. And it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, I know it's a cat. It's a side view of a cat's face. But that doesn't matter. It's what does the person see in it. And sometimes we might use it as an introduction around leadership to do with strengths. So choose an image that represents your greatest strength. Choose an image that represents something you're not great at. Sometimes I use the images when it comes to feedback. So I'll get people to choose images for other people. Toby, this is what I see in you as a strength, and this is what I find difficult about you, or whatever. And the thing that is so much more powerful with an image is people will find it easier to articulate more difficult things. As I say, if I ask you your emotion, you'll go, yeah, I'm good, or oh, I'm generally happy. But if I ask you to choose an image and, you say, oh, I feel really connected at the moment, so I've chosen the spider's web because when I'm at my best, I can connect people and I feel strong, just like a spider's web. That's a whole rich conversation that comes much deeper than just, oh, I feel good right now.
Yeah, so we have this sort of third object effect in a way. I can talk about this card, what's in that card. I don't have to talk about myself, which often comes easier to many people.
It's a safety.
And then, yeah.
I'm talking about the image. I'm actually talking about me, but it's safer behind the image.
So what I also find super interesting is you basically said you're connecting working with images and strengths in a way by, for example, inviting other people to pick a card, not for themselves, but for the other person. And through that, do a strengths appreciation, like pick a picture that represents a strength that I see in you. Can you talk a bit more about that? What would be a classic exercise that you do there?
Yeah, so when it comes to strengths, often we actually do a strengths profile. So we use the skills discovery, which people do the profile. And we still sometimes play strengths poker. They choose cards for themselves or for others, etc. But sometimes when I'm working with leaders, I do find it's hard for people sometimes to give feedback. So the images I often use as a feedback exercise where people can choose an image, not just for a strength, but sometimes for a weakness, depend on, the group and how it's working. And I ask them to choose images initially for each person in their little group, but then I ask them to give the feedback. And choosing the images they're usually okay with. But then when it comes to now I've got to tell you why I've chosen these images can be really kind of difficult. But one of the things that I've noticed at the end of it is everybody gets really uncomfortable initially. But once they've finished, the connection between people is significant. I've actually had people hug each other before. I've had tears before because often people don't give us feedback. We try and avoid the negative feedback. If we've got someone in our team who, isn't performing, we often try and ignore that and hope for the best, or we do it in a not so effective way. But the positive feedback, the strengths-based feedback often gets overlooked, not because we're bad people, but just because we get busy. Things go really well and I don't necessarily think about it, but stopping and choosing an image and then deliberately saying, Toby, this is what I see in you. This is how awesome I think you are. This is why I chose this image. It doesn't happen often enough that people give us that feedback. So I think there's ways that bring that real emotion to life. And as I say, images can create a buffer or a way of being able to perhaps go deeper and explain things that makes it a little more comfortable.
Amazing. Yeah. And this also very much reflects my experience, like doing these exercises, the first times I did it, I had the feeling, wow, I got so lucky now. This worked out so nicely. And then as I kept doing these exercises over the years, I realized, wow, this is not coincidence. This is not luck.
Exactly.
It's really the method.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally.
And at the same time, so I've been using this a lot. And at the same time, I have to say, I also am very much aligned with you in doing things that are based on evidence, like not drifting into the esoteric, which I think people often get the impression when we say, oh, everybody selects a picture now. It seems a bit odd, but it is also based in evidence. And what I've digged also quite a bit into that, but one aspect that I never really looked at is what actually happens in the brain. So maybe you could also, again, kind of explain a bit what are areas in the brain that are at interplay when we choose a picture and why not if we don't choose a picture.
Well, look, I think it's interesting. I often talk about two simple systems that most people will have heard about regularly: the limbic system, which is the emotional center, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is our sort of our logical, our rational, our higher order thinking, etc. And I think sometimes people think, oh, we need to be very logical, we need to be very rational, put the emotions to one side. And yet most people, hopefully by now, know that is not a very effective way of living your life. The reason we have these two systems in our brain is because we need these two systems in our brain. And the emotional center is so important for us because it's our intuition, it's our instinct, it's that emotional pull towards something. It's why I choose one image over another. So, for instance, why did I choose the heart with the little person hanging off it? Because I have that image. I resonated with that image. I stood in front of that image in Florence when my husband took it in a very similar way. So it had an emotional, it didn't have a rational reason to it. There was an emotional pull to why that one jumped out at me in that period of time. And when you think about that, it also engages our visual cortex because we're taking things in through imagery. It connects with our limbic system and our memory center. So what are the memories that we're then drawing on that's integrating? And then I've got my prefrontal cortex then rationally explains why I've chosen that and how it links to what I do. So I think for me, it's a way of engaging the brain. The thing that I love about the brain is we have different areas of the brain that support things around creativity, the moment of insight with the anterior cingulate cortex. We've got, as I say, the hippocampus, our memory center, which is drawing on things that nobody can see and we often can't explain, but there is an emotional reaction behind it, etc. So I love the fact that our brain is designed for stories, our brain is designed for imagery, and trying to remove parts of that removes the complexity that makes those exercises work. The reason they work is when you've got an image is because so many areas of the brain are then integrated and it's enhancing the experience, I suppose, for people.
So if I'm trying to paraphrase in a way, you're saying the prefrontal cortex is the part that is on my forehead, or right behind my forehead in a way. Yep. That is where logic and reason lives, if we can, at the risk of simplifying this, if we can say that. And then that's in a way where we probably spend most of our time when talking, when interacting in the business world, maybe. And then there's the limbic system, which is on the brain stem, more down the spine in a way, or towards
the middle.
Spine. Yeah, in the middle. And this is where emotions are being processed. And you're saying basically through pictures, we are making these two parts talk to each other in a way.
Together, yeah. And if you think about how your brain works in everyday things, sometimes I think the prefrontal cortex has been given elevated status over the years of like, oh, we need to be all rational and logical. But if you think about your prefrontal cortex, it's responsible for things like strategizing, problem solving, self-regulation, paying attention, those sorts of things. And we do need that part of your brain. And to your point, in the workplace, yes, in theory, we're doing a lot of that. We're using a lot of that activity. But I think we underestimate the power of the limbic system with that emotional pull, that intuition, that memory center that sort of sits in the limbic system. Because often what you're doing, even in the business world, is you're drawing on previous memories, previous learning, previous emotions, what feels right. If you're in a leadership role, you will hopefully be using your emotional intelligence to read facial cues on your team members that says something's wrong with that person, something's off. You will hopefully use your intuition in a sales meeting that says, actually, I need to jump in here because things are going off track. So I think we underestimate the limbic system. I think it's got a bad rap and people are like, oh no, leave your emotions at home. But to your point, when we work with imagery, when we work with our whole brain, we're going to be way more effective than if we just work with a little bit of it.
Yeah. And that is true for the leadership practice. How does it change my work as a coach, as a facilitator? Also having that knowledge about these different parts of the brain, of the kind of rational and the emotional sides.
Yeah, when your brain is working the best, it's when both systems are working together. So to your point is, yes, we think of the limbic system as that emotional center. But if you think about things like compassion as a coach, Compassion is different to empathy, and it actually uses different brain regions. So empathy, there is emotional empathy, which is when I feel what you feel. So if I'm a coach and I'm feeling what you're feeling, there is a physiological response I can tap into. I can feel what's going on for you. If you're feeling sad, I might start to feel sad. That's emotional empathy. And that mainly sits in the limbic system. We would see activity in the limbic system. Then we've got cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is when I know what you feel and I get it, but I might not come across as particularly warm. I might come across as cold. Yep, I can see you're sad. I get it. Deal with it, Emotional empathy, I understand it. That's more prefrontal cortex. But when we think of compassion, what Tanya Singer, who works out of Germany, she actually found is that compassion engages both the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, because I feel what you feel and I want to help support you to move forward. So if you think about a coach, whatever language you use, you need to be good as a coach at being able to pick up the emotional cues in your person. You ask them a question, they give you an answer, but you're seeing something emotionally different. You're seeing that whilst they're saying something, you're seeing something in their body language that's indicating they may not be fully in agreement with it, or you get the sense that they're putting the barriers down or they're covering up or something. A good coach is going to be able to see and pick up on those emotional cues. And there's a particular area of the brain, and it sits almost where the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex join, called the fusiform face area or the fusiform expert area. And it's specifically designed to read emotions in faces. So as a coach, we need to be using all of our brain to be able to pick up on those cues. But also, we don't want to get so caught up in the limbic system and the emotional empathy that we stop thinking clearly to help our client move forward. If you think about that as a consultant or a coach too, but a coach or a consultant, is a good consultant will use the energy of emotions to take a room on a journey. They'll know when to lift the energy in the room because they really want high energy, positive emotions, quick thinking, big picture. But they'll also know when to drop that energy to move much more into a reflective style, a weighing up of pros and cons, a deeper element. So again, this emotional center combined with the prefrontal cortex, as a coach or consultant, using those systems wisely and intentionally themselves and for others can be hugely helpful.
So in a way, what you're saying is both have their place. There is the prefrontal cortex that helps us to understand another person's situation and then empathize with them on a cognitive level, because maybe I have also been in that place and I remember when I was back there, then this and that. And then I understand cognitively, which is, of course, helpful, and we shouldn't discount that. But then there is also the limbic system, which maybe we often refer to as kind of the bodily level or the heart level or something, where it's more about feeling what they feel and sensing it on a less cognitive level in a way.
Yeah, and there's two components to what you've just said there. So one is, the limbic system is designed to be able to pick up on those cues, to feel what you feel, and using that wisely. But also, you mentioned the body. That's where we get into the whole interoception. So interoception means going within, and that's the physiological sensations. And that's a whole other piece of the emotion science, which is really cool. And again, people who are very, from a neurodiversity perspective, some people will be very highly attuned to those physiological sensations. Again, as a coach, you will probably find the better you get at being able to pick up on those physiological sensations, you'll know, you'll be able to be in tune with how your client is feeling, etc. But you'll also be able to be in tune of your own emotions when they might be taking you off track, or you're getting in a more heightened state when you're getting, you don't know what to ask next, you're feeling stuck. You're noticing it from a physiological perspective. And I have to admit, I love the science of interoception. I love the idea of our physiology changes through temperature, through our heartbeat, our breathing, the tension in various places. And being able to notice that, I think, as a coach is really useful. I'll give you an example. I remember I was doing an accreditation program around the Mesquite 2, which is an emotional intelligence tool. And we were doing some practice debriefs. And this particular gentleman, every time the person asked him a question about anger, his foot started tapping under the table. And then as soon as they moved on to something else, it stopped. And then they asked a question about anger again, and his foot started going. And after the third time, I interrupted and I said, just out of interest, what did you notice happen when you were talking about anger? He said, I don't know, didn't notice anything. I said, basically, your foot started going. And he was like, did it? He hadn't even noticed. But as soon as we started talking about it, he then started noticing the tension in his body, that he was getting agitated. And anger has quite a lot of energy to it. So that was where the energy was coming out, was through his foot tapping under the table. So being able to pick up on those cues from an interoception perspective, yes, there's a neuroscience piece to it, but actually going beyond that to the neurobiology and the full body can be so powerful for a coach if they're able to be in tune with their own and notice others.
Do you have any practical exercises that help me as a coach to get more attuned with that? And maybe also that help my client, in your example, maybe the guy with the moving leg?
Yeah,
to sort of connect calm their nervous system. What would you do?
There are many exercises around this. So I have a few that I do. Sometimes I ask other people to see if they can view it in others. So I do a little exercise that is around emotion poker. So I might have one person looking at a laptop and there's images on the laptop that are coming in quick succession, and the people observing, they don't get to see the laptop. They get to see the person's face. And they start to see if they can pick up what pictures and emotions are being evoked. So that's teaching people to be able to read it in others. If I'm trying to do it in others, one of the exercises I often do is I get people to think of an event or situation that's happened to them that's maybe a negative emotion, and then I might do a positive emotion where they recreate the emotion and they start to notice it in their body. Where do they feel it? What's going on? I was actually on a TV show called Redesign My Brain here in Australia a few years ago, and the key person, the host, whatever you would call him, he, at the end of the series of 3 sessions, he had to be chained up, so in a straitjacket with chains, and dropped into a swimming pool, and he had to get free. And my job in the first episode was to teach him how to manage his emotions. So from a physiological perspective, how could he go from fear to calm? And we did some really cool exercises around inducing fear and establishing what does fear feel like, what happens in your body, your heart racing, your breathing, you want to take in more oxygen, you often change in temperature, you might get more tense, etc. Well, that's not helpful if you've been dropped in the bottom of a swimming pool and you've got to get free while holding your breath. So we then moved the physiology to calm. Okay, how are we going to change that to a more calm situation? How do we relax the muscles through the body so that we can actually use those muscles well, but also so we can still think clearly? Because I'm sure, as you know, when you are in a heightened emotional state, your poor little prefrontal cortex goes offline and you can't think as clearly to be able to do what you need to do. So from a physiological perspective, even just getting people to practice. I had one beautiful lady, we did a session around interoception as part of a 2-day program, and she found it really difficult to feel anything in her body. So her action was at the end of the program, every time she took her dog for a walk, she was going to stop for 5 minutes and practice trying to create emotions in her body. So I didn't think anything more of it until 6 weeks later, I got a WhatsApp message saying, I felt something today. And basically she'd stopped halfway on her walking her dog and she'd go, I'm going to do anger. And she'd try and create anger in her body. And then she'd be like, excitement. And she was trying to practice these until she could actually feel it. And so just like anything, we practice, we get better.
So in a way, what I hear is it's a lot about paying attention in a way. So I guess meditation, doing body scans, this sort of work would also be useful.
Body scans can certainly be helpful. Meditation is a tool. It's a tool that can really help people from a well-being perspective. But we also have to bear in mind that the research is mixed. We often hear really great things about mindfulness, etc. But there are many people it doesn't work for. It makes no difference at all. But I think to your point, awareness, physiological awareness of where is your body in space. You know, if we go back to many years ago, Antonio Damasio's work, he actually found really simple things. If I ask you a question about the future, you will lean forward. Even if you don't think you've moved, you will lean forward. If I ask you a question about the past, you will lean back. Again, you might not think you've moved, but you have. If I ask you a question of something you're proud of, you will sit taller. You don't think you're moving, but your body changes accordingly. So anything that's improving your ability to be aware of what's going on inside your body and being able to evaluate that. And as an example, we know that anxiety and excitement have similar physiological tendencies. Heart speeds up, breathing speeds up, temperature changes. But can you distinguish the difference between anxiety and excitement? Because if you can't, every time you get excited, you think you're anxious, which can be debilitating for people.
Yeah, which makes sense. If we imagine this on this circleplex of emotions, right, where we would map emotions on a vertical scale to kind of indicate the energy. Are they high in energy or low?
Yep.
So excited versus tired. And then the balance, positive and negative. Then I think excitement and anxiety, they are also relatively close together, probably both high energy.
Yep.
And then it's just a question about, okay, which sort of connotation, which valence do I give this?
Yeah, absolutely. Am I giving it positive valence as in it's excited, or negative valence as in I'm anxious? And this is the thing, often people don't think about the energy behind emotions, the intensity, the fact that boredom is low energy disgust, or, the fact that some of the low energy negative emotions like sadness, despair, grief can be harder to get out of because there's no activity or energy in the body. Whereas you can't maintain rage for very long, or you can't maintain ecstatic for very long because there's so much energy it's going to dissipate. You can't maintain it. So I think teaching people about the science of emotions, the emotional energy, we often use our little emotion intensity cards because they help people understand exactly what you've just described, as in not just the valence, but also the arousal, the energy or intensity in those emotions. And again, sometimes people never learn that. We learn the basics at school of happy, sad, and angry, but we don't necessarily learn the nuance of the difference between pleased, amused, and positive, or the difference between curious, interested, and intrigued, for instance.
Yeah. Let's get to that in a minute. That is a super interesting point you're raising. But maybe one more question on this aspect of exercises, because earlier a lot of these exercises that you mentioned were sort of group-based demonstrations, or if we talk about meditation, it is sort of a continuous practice. What about a situation where I'm in a coaching session? I have this client who is very tense, very focused on his problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to get them to a more calm nervous system state, maybe focus on the future, on the solution. What sort of situational exercises could we do there?
That's a great question. I think there's two. One is overt exercises, as in if the client is up for it, you actually do the exercises in the room. So I would actually get them to, okay, let's just pause. What do you notice happening in your body? Tell me what you notice right now about your breathing, your tension, your energy, the way you're sitting, the way you're holding yourself, the tension. And then let's see if we can shift it. So I would actually do it with the person. And I've done that often in a one-on-one session. I've literally called it out in the moment of what am I seeing, what am I noticing, and then getting them to shift and change it there and then. The other thing that I do is more covert, which is if you don't want to call it out of the person, you do it yourself. So if you are in a one-on-one situation and you're in rapport with somebody and you feel that they're too heightened for what you're trying to achieve next, what can you do to bring your energy down, to shift and change the tension in your own body, your own voice, etc., and just shifting that? Or if you want to move to something more exciting, so tell me more about that. How do we take you on that journey? What ideas do you have? And lifting your energy. And that links to what I talk about, the energy chart, which you just described about the valence and arousal, is that I can use my energy to take the other person where they need to go in order to get a different outcome. And I've done this on many occasions. I remember one particular lady, we were in a one-on-one situation, and I really got the sense that she was feeling angry. She was answering the questions, we were doing the coaching, etc. But I just got this sense in her body, the tension in her voice, the neck, etc., that there was the anger underlying. And so I paused and I just said, look, I might be wrong. And I always say that. I might be wrong, but I'm getting the sense that you're feeling angry. And she went, no, I'm fine. No, honestly, I'm fine. I'm good. Okay, cool. we continued on. I was still getting the sense of this anger simmering under the surface. And I said, look, I'm going to pause again. I said, look, I appreciate I might be wrong, but I'm really getting the sense of anger behind what you're saying. And I think it's because you feel like a failure. And she burst into tears. And she went, you're absolutely right. I am so angry because I was put in this position based on my past experience. I'd fixed a difficult team before. They put me into this role to fix this team. And I haven't been able to do it. And I'm angry. I'm frustrated. I'm not getting where I need to go. She said, you're absolutely right. And later we talked about how did I know? Again, I talked about the physiological things that I was noticing in her, the tension through her chest, the way her gestures were a lot more staccato, the way the tension through her jaw was changing the tone of her voice. And she hadn't even paid attention to that.
Wow. So number one is helping the client pay attention to themselves by actually being observant ourselves and pointing that out, like helping them to spot things in their own body in a way. And then the other aspect that you mentioned is what I learned, like my early education as a coach 10 years ago was in NLP. Everybody was doing NLP practitioners 10 years ago, I have the feeling. And there you learn this idea of pacing and leading.
Yeah.
So in a way, you get on the energy level of the client until you establish a rapport. You're really swinging along with the client. And then you can also lead the way. And that means either if you want to calm them down, speaking slower, getting more calm yourself, or lifting up the energy level, being more lively.
Yeah. And in the emotion science, it's about the ability to what they call connect emotions. So I always talk about the pure model of emotional intelligence, which is about perceive, connect, understand, and manage. And connecting emotions is where you connect emotions to thought and emotions to body. And somebody who's a good coach will do that well. They'll take people on that journey. They'll be able to really connect emotions. They know that they want to get more deep reflection. They will drop energy so that the person can then think more clearly and be able to process what it is that they're going through. So yeah, that's for me, as NLP, some of it was based on science, some of it not. I like to stick to the bits that were based on science. And that's actually a really cool piece of connecting emotions with thought and connecting emotions with body.
Yeah, you were already bringing us into a new direction, which I also really liked, which was this notion of a person being able to say, I feel like shit, versus a person being able to say, I feel disappointed, I feel lonely, etc.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a really good one. And if I'm just going to go back to those 4 abilities that I tend to focus on. So perceive, connect, understand, and manage emotions. One of the things that we know from the research and the science is expanding someone's emotional vocabulary actually helps improve 3 of the 4 of those abilities. So even just improving someone's vocabulary improves their ability to perceive emotion in self and others, to understand emotions, so to understand the progression, if you like, the cognitive element of emotions, and manage emotions, which is based on somebody like Matt Lieberman's work from a neuroscience perspective of being able to label emotions helps calm down emotions. So one of the things that I find is often people don't have a very rich emotional vocabulary. So if you're looking at a very low emotional vocabulary, you ask me how I am, and I say, I'm okay, I'm good, or I'm not bad, thanks. That's very low emotional vocab. If I've got average emotional vocab, I'll say I'm happy, sad, angry, maybe a few more words. But if I've got a richer emotional vocab, when you ask me how I feel, assuming you genuinely want to know, then I'm much more likely to be able to say, do you know what? I'm angry, but I'm also embarrassed, humiliated, and disappointed in myself. Now, that's a whole other scope when you can go that nuance, because there are very different emotional management strategies you're going to use for anger than there are for embarrassed, humiliated, and disappointed in myself. And again, it's one of the reasons we created our little emotion cards, mainly because my emotional vocabulary was terrible. So I created them for myself initially. But to really try to get people to expand their emotional vocabulary and understand the nuance behind them, because it then helps you deal with them better.
Yeah, exactly. This is also what we build tools for in coaching conversations, basically saying, okay, let's get out some emotion cards and say, okay, how do you feel? And then say, okay, here we have all that nuance from joy to shock in a way. And that enables the client to really pinpoint it.
Yeah. Beautiful. And when you think about
And-
that, I'm going to use a couple that you've got on there as examples. So you've got shame and guilt on there. I think it's really interesting. There's a distinction between shame and guilt, because guilt is, I feel guilty about something I have or haven't done. And it's usually an action orientation. So if you think about guilt, I might feel guilty because I haven't rung my mother for 2 weeks. Guilt is great because it's an action, and I am more likely to then rectify it by ringing my mother because it's something I haven't done and it's something I can do. Whereas shame is really interesting because it goes internal. So shame is more about, I am a bad daughter because I haven't rung my mother. I am terrible daughter. I'm the worst daughter in the world. I am bad because I haven't rung my mother. And that's really interesting because it's internally focused, and they've found then I'm less likely to act because I feel bad. I feel worthless. It's not about the action. And I think that's a lovely way of thinking about guilt and shame, because if I can turn shame to guilt and turn it outward again, well, rather than, no, I'm not the worst daughter in the world, but I probably should have rung my mother, so let me pick up the phone and ring my mother, I am dealing with that emotion. Whereas if I just sit with it, and they found this as well, things like in the workplace, if I make a mistake, which let's face it, all of us have made mistakes at work. If I make a mistake and feel guilty about it, I'm much more likely to come to you, my boss, and say, boss, I've stuffed up. This is what's happened. This is what I can do. How do I rectify it, etc. I'm much more likely to take action. If I feel shame, ironically, I'm more likely to try and hide my action and not tell you and hope I can get away with it.
So what you're saying is that in a way, guilt is the more productive emotional word because it gives us the freedom to act, while shame is a lot tied to identity and I cannot do anything about my identity.
Absolutely. And if I feel ashamed of something, I'm beating myself up internally. So I often try and talk to people about how can I then turn that shame into external of what is it I'm ashamed of. I had an example the other day. A lady came up to me. She was clearly distressed. She came up to me at the end of a program and she said, I made a really big mistake at work. I feel terrible about it. I've handed my notice in. I should never have done it. I've got 25 years of experience. It was a complete mistake. And I've handed my notice in because I would fire me if somebody else, if I was my boss, so to speak. And I said, that's really interesting. I said, as long as you keep it as guilt, you feel guilty because you did an action. She said, what can I do about it? I said, what can you do about it? You've handed your notice in. What can you do to rectify it? And she said, yeah, I'm going to sit down with them and say, well, these are the steps that they can take, etc. But she said, as far as I'm concerned, I have to leave. But I said, what you've got to be careful of, you don't then take it on board and say, I am terrible, I am no good, etc. Because then you won't put yourself in another role in the future or put yourself forward because you'll be like, oh no, I shouldn't be in this role. This is that imposter syndrome that then comes out of I'm no good, etc. So I just think they're two very interesting emotions that if we can try and externalize it again and say, what was the action? What is the thing that I should or shouldn't have done? It saves my sense of self-esteem a bit of a battering.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you point out these two because we also talked a lot about them and the distinction coming from a nonviolent communication training. Mm-hmm. And there in the nonviolent communication NVC world, you sometimes have people who say, well, guilt is not a real feeling because it's very cognitive. It is this concept of, okay, I should have A, but I did B, so I'm guilty. And that's why it isn't even a feeling, and we should rather not have it in a feeling card set because it's rather a thought or a kind of a very cognitive concept. What would you say about that?
It's really interesting. So we go back to how the brain is wired, limbic system, prefrontal cortex. I can make an argument that both guilt and shame are cognitive because guilt, exactly as you said, it has a cognitive, as in I haven't rung my mother and I feel I should have rung my mother. There's a cognitive, there's an expectation. Good daughters ring their mother. I feel guilty because I haven't rung her. But I can make the argument for shame as well, as in, I'm a bad daughter because I haven't rung my mother. Oh my goodness, I'm ashamed of myself. I am so bad. There's a cognitive element. Why do I think I'm bad? What's going on that I think my expectation is that I should ring my mother every week? There's a cognitive expectation in that. So to your point, the way that the brain works is you can't take emotion and cognition and separate them, but these are absolutely still both emotions. Whether the person agrees or not, they have an emotional component to them. Curiosity is an emotion, but it has a cognitive component, as in I'm leaning in, I'm wanting to find out more, I'm interested in something and I'm being curious about it. So I think most emotions probably have a component of both. There's a cognitive element in most of them. Well, even if you think of the basics, most people would agree that happiness and sadness are emotions, but there's still a cognitive element. So if you think about happiness, anybody experiences when something is going my way or I gain something of value. Well, think about the words of value. There's a cognitive component to that. Because I'll give you the example I often give is when I do a keynote presentation, even though the client is often paying you sometimes to do this, sometimes they feel they need to give you a little gift at the end. So you come off stage and somebody says thank you and they go, here you go, and there's a gift. And in many cases, in my experience, it's been a bottle of red wine. And a bottle of red wine is lovely, but I don't drink red wine. So there is a component that says, yes, I'm happy, thank you for the gift, but I don't value it because I don't particularly like red wine. But if you give me a bar of chocolate or a box of chocolates, I value chocolates more so than red wine, so I'm going to be happier. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in a way, it's also about expectation versus reality, or in a way, yeah.
And value. If you look at most of the...
I'm not sure if it's that.
Yeah, most of the primary emotions, there's a value element. If you think about sadness, it's loss of something of value. So there's a cognitive component that's linked to their memory, their experience, so it's more value. If you think about anger is I'm being blocked from something I value or something is getting in the way. So there's always the of value. You might get angry about something that I'm like, what's the fuss about? And I get angry about something that you're like, who cares? But the value that we place on it will often be a cognitive element.
Nice. Okay. Now we talked a lot about pictures and emotions, and I think I would also like to slowly wrap up. But I think there's a whole other area of the positive psychology toolbox that we could get into, maybe not today, but maybe another day. And that is strengths and values. And maybe one question as a cliffhanger in that direction. Because I know you also work with all of these, and I'm wondering, how do you choose situationally when to bring out which tool? Pictures, emotions, maybe also strengths and values?
It's a great question. For me, it's really depends on what my audience is and what they're wanting. If I'm working with a client, what is it that they're focused on? One of the things that I think is interesting with strengths and values, though, is values work. In fact, the meeting I had just before this one, the lady said on the program she did with me, it was the values exercise that she changed her life around because she'd been offered a role that she didn't think was for her and she wasn't keen. And it was like, she said it was the pointy end of sort of mental health and she didn't know if she wanted to be there again. But then she checked her values during this values exercise and she realized actually that was aligned to who she was, and she's been working, it took her where she is now, which she's absolutely loving, and it's shifted her life. So I think values, most people know what values are in a cognitive perspective. They can put it's your guiding principles or whatever, they put a definition to it. But stopping and asking yourself, what are your values and are you living aligned to your values, can be a really powerful conversation. And your values, in theory, underpin everything you do. They underpin your decisions you make, how you reward yourself, everything. So I think values work and values activities can be really useful for helping somebody really get to grips with who they are, what they stand for, how they want to live their life. Strengths for me is a tool that you might dial up or dial down depending on the situation. So as an example, I have fairness as one of my top values. If I see something that is unfair, it causes me an emotional reaction. I have making a difference as one of my top values. So I want to make sure everything I do every day is about making a difference in the world, that ripple effect that we mentioned. But strengths are like the tools that I might bring in order to make that difference. So it might be now, for instance, I am using my strength of narrator and spotlight. I'm telling you stories in answer to your questions. I'm in the spotlight. I'm on camera. They are strengths that I'm dialing up right now to bring to life the making a difference. But there might be other occasions. So you might be dialing up or dialing down strengths. All of those are in pursuit of my value of making a difference and my value of fairness. But I'm using different strengths in order to bring those values to life. So that's probably how I would decide what to do with a client. Emotions underpin everything that I do. It's just part of it. Neuroscience underpins everything that I do. But values and strengths, I love the strengths approach because everybody will have many different strengths. And I love that, the fact that you will have certain strengths that you used this morning that you will be different to what you'll use this afternoon. You'll use certain strengths when you're doing a one-on-one coaching session than you will when you're doing a group session. You're more than just one or two things. And that's what I love around strengths. We can dial. It's a bit like lights in your house. I use the example of when you get home at night, you don't turn on every light in every room of the house. You turn on the ones that are suitable for what you're doing. If you're cooking, you might want the kitchen lights on and the hob light on because you want to see what you're doing. If you're watching a movie, you want the lights down low. If you're having a romantic dinner, you want candles. If you're reading a book in bed, you want your bedside light. And so strengths for me are a bit like that. It's an opportunity to use your strengths to contribute the best you can to the situation you've got at the time.
Yeah, I really like that, because what you're saying basically is that strengths are not only about capability, competency, but also in a way about identity. Who am I? Which lights do I have in my house? And this is what was also quite transformative in my own strengths journey.
I think so, but I worry that sometimes people get attached to one or two strengths of that's my identity, and yet you will have many. And I keep mine beside me, but I don't want to think that just my top ones are my identity. I want to think about in certain I need. So it's like tools in a toolkit. What's the analogy? If you've only got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. If you've only got action as a strength, then you're just getting on with stuff all the time, but you might not be thinking about it. You might not be looking at the big picture. So for me, strengths are about, the different tools or the different lights that you turn on. And one of the phrases that I really love, and Robert Biswas-Diener talks about this a lot, is strengths are not about your ability to shine necessarily. It's your ability to contribute. And how are you using your strengths to contribute in your meeting today? And maybe the meeting that you're in this morning requires your strengths of counterpoint, because you want to be able to challenge and offer a different viewpoint. But there might be a meeting later on this afternoon where somebody needs to dial up their strength of compassion because it's a one-on-one and somebody's going through something difficult. You don't want your counterpoint in that meeting. So for me, that's what I love about strengths. It's not just identity. It's part of who you are, but it's really being able to dial them up and down depending on what's needed in the situation.
Yeah, cool. And then for values, maybe it's about direction, emotion. It's kind of meeting people where they are, I think.
Values, I think, is more about identity because it's, to your point, is I will have an emotional reaction if I see things that go against my value or go towards my values. So I think values is part of my identity, it's part of who I am, but you'll always know it because you'll have an emotional reaction. When something is aligned to your values, you'll have a positive emotional response and you can be like, that's my value of so-and-so. When you have a negative emotional response, you also might find that you've had one of your values buttons pushed, if you like.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Nice. I think we could go deeper, but I can also dear listener, point you to the episode with Tim Brownson, where we also really went deep into values, and then on strengths, we have plenty. And maybe one day we also can continue this conversation here, Sue. But to conclude, if I'm a coach, a facilitator, how can I get started, learn more about these things, and also do so with you?
Oh, look, there's so many ways you can learn more in this space, whether you're delving into the science of emotions through books, podcasts, etc., or the positive psychology literature, the research. If people want to contact me, they can either go to langleygroup.com.au or suelangley.com, or they can connect with me on LinkedIn. They can email me, sue@langleygroup.com.au, and I will respond to any and every email and message that comes my way.
Awesome. Cool. We'll also put all these profiles and websites in the show notes. And then I say thank you for today.
Thank you. It's been awesome.
This was my conversation with Sue Langley from the Langley Group. And not sure about you, but I really enjoyed the conversation, in particular because I felt a super high alignment in how Sue cares about her impact, how she believes positive psychology offers the tools that the world needs right now, and how she practices all of this with the scientific rigor that you can give to all of that. You can follow up with her. You can follow her work with a bunch of links in the show notes. And I'm genuinely excited to continue our conversation on values and strengths, and who knows what else, in a few months from now. Either way, the next podcast episode on this show is already just 2 weeks away. Until then, I wish you an inspiring summer break and all the best on your journey towards becoming an impactful coach. I'm Toby, co-founder of MetaFox. Hear you soon again here. Bye-bye.
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.